Namaskar. Prayers for your and your family members' safety and health. How are you all? Congratulations for clearing your 10th standard board examinations. This is your first session of English FL. FL means first language. This year in 11th standard you have two books for English. One is known as Hornbill, another is Snapshots. Hornbill is the textbook and Snapshots is the supplementary reader. In this video session, we are going to take up chapter number 1 of our textbook, that is Hornbill. The first chapter is written by Khushwant Singh. The name of the chapter is Khushwant Singh's grandmother is the lady here. Khushwant Singh, the very famous writer, has portrayed his grandmother. So in this chapter we are going to see how Khushwant Singh has relation with his grandmother, how the grandmother helps him, the village life, the city life, and the life after Khushwant Singh comes back from foreign country back to India. What changes happen in the relationship of the writer and his grandmother. So let us read this chapter. Lesson 1. The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Notice these expressions in the text. Infer their meaning from the context. You will find here 7 different expressions. These expressions are used in the lesson. Notice these expressions as they are used in the lesson. They are highlighted in bold letters in the chapter. Right now, let us read these expressions. The first one. The thought was almost revolting. Second, an expanse of pure white serenity. Third, a turning point. Fourth, accepted her seclusion with resignation. Fifth, a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. Sixth, frivolous rebukes. Seventh, the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum. So I want you to notice the use of these expressions in this chapter. Let us start reading the chapter. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband. But that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. In this first paragraph of the chapter, we notice that the author, Khushwant Singh, tells us that his grandmother is very old. She has a wrinkled face, and this condition is there for the past 20 years. If he listens to the people around him, they tell Khushwant Singh that your grandmother was once a very young lady and she was very pretty. She also had a husband. Okay, so to this, Khushwant Singh says that it's hard to believe. Well, we know that obviously she will be having a husband, and therefore she has got the grandchildren. But because of this old age and because of this wrinkled face, Khushwant Singh can never think, his mind can never accept that this lady would be once upon a time a young lady. That's why he says that it is hard to believe. Okay, when there is a mention of the grandfather, that is Khushwant Singh's grandmother and her husband. Okay, so Khushwant Singh now writes that there is a portrait in the drawing room. The grandfather is seen with a big turban and loose fitting clothes. He has a long beard. Okay, and he also looks 100 years old. And once again he says that such kind of man who is very old, one cannot imagine that he would be having a wife or children. Why? Because he is so old that he can have only grandchildren. Coming back to the grandmother, he says that his grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So this meaning that this thought that grandmother was young and pretty could not be accepted. Notice the bold letters. This expression is there in the beginning of the chapter. So this way, the first expression given in the list of 7 expressions, the thought was almost revolting. The first one you find here. Let's move ahead. Khushwant Singh tells us that grandmother used to tell stories, and her stories, though they were based on her life, they were real stories, but for Khushwant Singh, the stories were like fables. Fables that could not happen in the real life. So such stories she would tell. He also feels that the games that the grandmother used to play when she was young was very undignified, very absurd. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. In this part, we notice Khushwant Singh once again mentions the wrinkles on the face of his grandmother. And once again, he stresses the point that the grandmother is very, very old. She was the same for the past 20 years. This also is mentioned once again. And Khushwant Singh says that she was always beautiful. And there is a contrast between the two words, which probably have the same meaning, pretty and beautiful. Notice this line. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Then Khushwant Singh mentions the movements of his grandmother in the house. That she would move in spotless white cloths. In one hand, she would have the beads of her rosary. The second hand would be used to balance a stoop because she was slightly bent. And this way she would move around in the house. Then always her lips would be moving in prayer, and the prayer would be inaudible. Matlab she would not sing the prayer loudly. It was an inaudible prayer. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her face, and she was always quiet. Khushwant Singh makes a comparison here that the quietness, the calmness of the grandmother, the silence of the grandmother is compared with the silence of the mountains. Mountains which are snow clad. So the expression, an expanse of pure white serenity. So here she was a very calm and quiet person, and this had an effect in the environment of the house also, we can say that. And therefore the author has written that she was breathing peace and contentment. She was very happy, at peace with her. She was satisfied with her life. Now let us move on to the third paragraph. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. In this paragraph, Khushwant Singh tells about the village life when they were staying together. That is, his grandmother and himself, while the parents were in the city. So here we find that the day would start with grandmother helping Khushwant Singh to get ready for the school. Khushwant Singh that time was a young boy going to school. So grandmother used to wake him up, get him ready. Even she would help him bathe. And while all these things were being done, and while the morning routine was on, grandmother would sing this prayers loudly. Well, one purpose behind this was so that Khushwant Singh would learn the prayers. But we come to know the frank acceptance of Khushwant Singh, saying that he would love to listen to the grandmother but would never bother, or he did not bother to learn the prayers. Then both of them would go to school. The school was alongside the temple only. Grandmother would make things ready for him. The bag, well, there was no bag that we have today, but things were packed in a bundle, like things like the ink pot, the slate, and along with it some breakfast. But before that, they had the breakfast of chapatis with sugar and bread. And then they would move. They would also carry along with them some chapatis. This was for the dogs. Let us move on to the next one. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. While the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. In this part, we come to know that Khushwant Singh and his grandmother would go to school. The school and the temple were in the same campus. The priest was a teacher. So the priest would do two things. He would read the scriptures. He would also teach students alphabet. This way, the school time will be on for the author, and by the time when the school was on, the grandmother would sit in the temple and do some prayers. When the school was over, both Khushwant Singh and his grandmother would return back home. This time, when they were back home, they would be greeted with the village dogs, and the chapatis that they had brought along with them would be given to the dogs. So this way, we see the relationship between the author and his grandmother in the village. That was the end of today's video session. In our next video session, we will continue further and we will see how the relationship changes when they go to the city. We will also read further in the next session. But till then, I want you to read the chapter. So meet you in the next video session. Till then, bye. God bless you. May peace be with you.